My name is Julia. I am 33 years old and I work as an independent forensic auditor. After my grandparents died in a plane crash, their lawyer revealed that I was the sole heir to their $60 million estate. My family demanded I hand it over. I refused. The next day, they came to evict me from my grandparents' villa, but froze when they saw who was standing beside me. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to entitled family members who severely underestimated your true worth. The icy atmosphere of the mahogany-paneled waiting room at the law firm of Harrison and Associates perfectly matched the profound chill in my heart. It had been exactly 1 week since the private charter plane carrying my grandfather Henry went down over the mountains. I sat completely alone on a rigid leather sofa, with my hands resting quietly in my lap. I was the only person in my entire family who had actually shed a tear for the man. The rest of them were far too busy calculating their impending financial payouts to bother with genuine grief. My grandfather and I shared a deep bond that no one else in the family ever understood. He was a brilliant self-made man who built a massive empire in logistics and commercial real estate from absolute scratch. While my parents viewed his immense wealth as an endless personal bank account, I viewed his disciplined work ethic as a blueprint for my own life. That was exactly why I chose to become a forensic auditor. It was a career path my family endlessly mocked at every holiday gathering. They genuinely thought I was just a lowly, uninspired bean counter. They had absolutely no idea that my daily professional life consisted of dismantling complex corporate fraud tracking, hidden offshore assets, and analyzing financial discrepancies for elite corporate clients. The heavy double doors of the waiting room suddenly swung open and shattered the quiet morning air. In marched my mother Catherine, my father William, and my older sister Courtney. Courtney was 35 years old and the undisputed golden child of our family hierarchy. She strode into the room dripping in expensive designer labels she absolutely could not afford on her non-existent salary. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled, and her makeup was totally flawless. There was not a single trace of mourning or sadness in her demeanor. My father wore a custom-tailored Italian suit and carried his leather briefcase like a weapon. My mother trailed closely behind them while holding her expensive handbag tightly against her chest. They did not greet me. They did not offer a comforting hug or a kind word. Instead, my mother marched directly to where I was sitting and slammed a thick piece of paper onto the glass coffee table right in front of me. It was a formal legal renunciation of inheritance form. I stared down at the intrusive document and then looked up at my mother. I quietly asked her what this paper was supposed to be. Courtney let out a harsh, mocking laugh and crossed her arms tightly over her expensive silk blouse. "Just sign it, Julia," she said, her voice dripping with the exact same condescension she had weaponized against me since we were young children. "You know Dad manages the family trust funds anyway, so this is just a minor formality. I need to clear the massive loan on my Porsche Macan, pay off my summer vacation to the Amalfi Coast, and cover my personal stylist fees by the end of the month. What do you even need actual money for anyway?" Her eyes raked critically over my simple black blazer and slacks, her lip curling into a visible sneer. "You have been wearing the same cheap business suits since college while living in that tiny cramped apartment. You would not even know what to do with real wealth if it was handed to you." My mother nodded in vigorous agreement and leaned forward to tap her manicured fingernail against the blank signature line. "Your sister is entirely right, Julia. You deliberately chose a very modest life counting numbers in a cubicle for other people. Courtney has a certain elite standard of living to maintain. She represents our family in high society circles and attends important charity galas. You have always preferred to hide in the shadows and avoid social obligations. Just sign the paper right now so we can get this tedious legal process over with. We have an important brunch reservation at the country club at noon and we cannot be late." The sheer audacity of their demand did not surprise me in the slightest. This was the exact toxic hierarchy I had endured my entire life. Courtney was the beautiful socialite who received everything she ever demanded. She was completely shielded from the harsh consequences of her reckless financial decisions. I was the designated scapegoat, the quiet disappointment, who was continually expected to sacrifice my own comfort to subsidize her luxury. But they were dealing with the 33-year-old woman I had become, not the terrified child I used to be. My rigorous career in forensic accounting had taught me how to read people, how to spot manipulation tactics instantly, and how to remain absolutely stoic under extreme pressure. I calmly placed my hands on my knees, looked Courtney directly in the eye, and spoke in a steady, unwavering voice. "Pay for your own car, Courtney." The silence that followed my words was absolute and suffocating. Courtney gasped loudly, and her mouth fell open in pure shock. My mother stepped back as if I had physically struck her across the face. My father's face immediately darkened with intense rage. He took a threatening step toward me with his hands clenching into tight fists at his sides. "Listen to me, you ungrateful little brat," he began, his voice dropping to a dangerous, aggressive growl. "You will do exactly as you are told. You do not disrespect your sister, and you certainly do not defy me in public." Before he could finish his angry tirade, the heavy wooden door to the inner office clicked open. Mr. Harrison, the senior partner of the law firm, stepped out holding a thick manila folder. He adjusted his glasses and looked at our tense group with a professional detachment. "The Wilson family," he said formally. "Please come in. We are ready to begin the reading of the will." My father instantly smoothed his expression and transformed back into the polished, respectable businessman he pretended to be. He adjusted his silk tie and ushered my mother and sister into the grand office, shooting me one last warning glare over his shoulder. I picked up my purse and followed them inside, leaving the unsigned renunciation form sitting permanently on the glass table. Mr. Harrison's office was expansive and lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. The room smelled faintly of old paper and expensive leather furniture. We took our seats in the plush chairs arranged in a neat semicircle in front of his massive wooden desk. Courtney sat on the very edge of her seat and practically vibrated with greedy anticipation. She kept checking her reflection in her phone screen, completely unbothered by the solemnity of the occasion. My father sat back with his legs crossed, comfortably projecting an air of absolute financial control. Mr. Harrison cleared his throat and opened the heavy folder. He began with the standard legal preambles, verifying the exact date of the will and confirming that my grandfather Henry was of sound mind and body when the document was officially drafted. He then read through several minor bequests, including generous charitable donations to local hospitals and small stipends left to longtime household staff members. Courtney tapped her foot impatiently and sighed loudly. Finally, Mr. Harrison reached the primary distribution of assets. To my granddaughter, Courtney Wilson, he read aloud, his voice clear and resonant in the quiet room. "I leave the sum of $10,000. He paused and deliberately turned the page. "I sincerely hope this modest sum encourages her to finally seek gainful employment and learn the true value of a hard-earned dollar." The room instantly erupted into chaos. Courtney shrieked and jumped up from her chair. $10,000, she screamed, her face turning bright red with indignation. "That is completely impossible. That will not even cover one single month of my credit card bills. There has to be a catastrophic mistake. He meant 10 million. Tell me he meant 10 million right now." My mother grabbed Mr. Harrison's desk with both hands, her eyes wide with frantic panic. "You must have read that incorrectly. Henry absolutely adored Courtney. She was his absolute favorite grandchild. There is no way he would insult her with such a pathetic amount of money." Mr. Harrison looked over his glasses, his expression entirely neutral. "I assure you there is no mistake, Mrs. Wilson. The wording is quite specific and was double-checked by my entire legal team." My father held up a hand and silenced my mother and sister. "Fine," he said, his jaw tight with barely contained fury. The old man always was eccentric in his old age. "Just get to the rest of the document. What about the primary estate? What about the holding companies and the commercial properties? Mr. Harrison adjusted the papers in his hands and continued reading calmly. To my granddaughter, Julia Wilson, I leave the remainder of my entire estate. This includes the Lake George Villa, the primary residence, all remaining liquid assets, and the entirety of my commercial investment portfolios. The total estimated value of this distribution is approximately $60 million. I leave this immense responsibility to Julia because she is the only person in this family who possesses the integrity, the intellect, and the strong moral compass to manage it properly. The air was instantly sucked out of the room. I sat perfectly still with my heart pounding a steady rhythm against my ribs. $60 million. The beautiful Lake George Villa. Everything. My grandfather had seen everything clearly. He had known exactly what my parents were doing behind closed doors, and exactly how they treated me. He had deliberately chosen to empower me in the most undeniable way possible. Courtney let out a sound that was half sob and half scream. She collapsed back into her chair and buried her face in her hands. My mother stumbled backward and shook her head in complete denial. But it was my father who truly lost control. The polished corporate veneer shattered completely. He turned a dangerous mottled shade of purple. He lunged forward and slammed his heavy fists down onto the oak desk with a violent crash that made the pens rattle in their cups. "You will not see a single dime of this money," he roared, his face contorted with rage. "You think you have won. You think you can just take what rightfully belongs to me. I still hold his medical and financial power of attorney. I completely control the primary accounts. I will freeze every single asset by noon today. You will be begging me for scraps by the time I am done with you." The next morning, I walked into the grand marble lobby of First National Bank with a single purpose. I needed to finalize the payments for my grandfather's funeral arrangements. The floral displays, the catering for the reception, the transport logistics. All of it required significant immediate capital. I approached the teller station and presented the trust account details Mr. Harrison had provided me just 24 hours earlier. The young teller typed on her keyboard for a moment, then frowned. Her brow furrowed in confusion, and she typed the account numbers again. "I am so sorry, Miss Wilson," she said, avoiding my eyes. "It appears there is a hard freeze on all accounts associated with this estate. You do not have access to these funds." I felt a cold knot form in the pit of my stomach. "What do you mean a hard freeze?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly level. "The estate was legally transferred to my name yesterday. I have the signed documentation from the executor." The teller looked incredibly uncomfortable. She glanced nervously toward the glass-enclosed office of the bank manager. "Mr. Sterling, the branch manager, placed the freeze early this morning. He received a formal notice from William Wilson claiming immediate medical and financial power of attorney. The paperwork indicated there were severe concerns regarding your mental fitness to manage these assets." The sheer audacity of my father's actions hit me like a physical blow. He had actually done it. He had used a completely outdated, legally void power of attorney document to intimidate a local bank manager into locking me out of my own inheritance. He was trying to financially starve me into submission, just like he had always done when anyone in the family dared to defy his strict orders. He wanted me desperate. He wanted me to come crawling back to him on my hands and knees, begging for access to the money so he could dictate the terms of my surrender. I did not scream at the teller. I did not demand to see Mr. Sterling and throw a loud, embarrassing tantrum in the middle of the bank lobby. I simply nodded, retrieved my identification documents, and walked out the glass doors into the crisp morning air. My father fundamentally misunderstood who he was dealing with. He still viewed me as the quiet, obedient daughter who sat in the corner during family dinners and accepted whatever scraps of attention or financial support he deemed appropriate. He and my mother truly believed I was just a low-level corporate accountant pushing numbers around on spreadsheets for a mediocre salary. They had absolutely no idea that I was an elite forensic auditor. My entire professional career was built on dismantling complex corporate fraud tracking, hidden offshore shell companies, and analyzing massive financial discrepancies for powerful corporate clients. I did not need his permission to access my own money, and I certainly did not need his approval to tear his entire financial empire down to the studs. I drove straight to my private office in the city. I bypassed the frozen personal accounts completely. I sat down at my custom multi-monitor workstation and logged into my secure encrypted databases. If my father wanted to play a high-stakes game of financial warfare, I was more than ready to engage. I started by pulling the public financial filings of his prized real estate development company, Wilson Enterprises. I meticulously cross-referenced their declared revenue streams against their outstanding commercial loan obligations. Within 2 hours, I found exactly what I was looking for. The irregularities were not just minor accounting errors. They were massive, glaring red flags that indicated systemic long-term financial manipulation. Wilson Enterprises was bleeding cash at an astonishing rate. They were leveraging assets they did not actually own to secure new lines of credit to pay off older defaulting loans. It was a classic aggressive shell game, and the entire structure was teetering on the absolute edge of catastrophic collapse. My father was not freezing my grandfather's assets out of some misplaced sense of family loyalty or concern for my well-being. He was freezing them because he desperately needed that $60 million to save his own sinking ship. While I was deep in the digital ledgers tracking the fraudulent flow of money, my personal cell phone began to vibrate relentlessly against the surface of my desk. Notifications flooded my screen in rapid succession. I ignored them at first, focused entirely on downloading the incriminating corporate data onto a secure, encrypted hard drive. But the constant buzzing finally forced me to look. The notifications were not from my bank or my lawyer. They were social media alerts, text messages, and missed calls from dozens of extended family members. I opened the first text message from my Aunt Sarah. It was a link to a video on a popular social media platform, accompanied by a single furious sentence. "How could you do this to your own family, Julia?" I clicked the link. The video featured my sister Courtney sitting on the plush velvet sofa in my parents' expansive living room. She was wearing minimal makeup to look pale and exhausted, and she was crying perfectly manufactured tears. She dabbed her eyes with a tissue and looked directly into the camera, projecting an image of absolute heartbreak and vulnerability. "My grandfather passed away a week ago," Courtney said in the video, her voice trembling with artificial emotion. "We are all completely devastated by the loss of our family patriarch. But what makes this tragedy even worse is what happened right before he died. My sister Julia, who has always been incredibly distant and resentful, isolated my grandfather during his final months. She manipulated a sick, confused old man into changing his will and leaving his entire life's work to her alone. She stole our family legacy while we were mourning. We just want justice for my grandfather. We want to protect what he built from someone who is clearly exploiting his grief." The video had already been viewed thousands of times. The comments section was a toxic wasteland of strangers attacking my character, calling me a gold digger, a sociopath, and a grief-exploiting thief. My extended family members, aunts, uncles, cousins, I had not spoken to in years, were actively sharing the video and adding their own hateful commentary. They were publicly branding me as a monster to justify my parents' illegal actions. Courtney had launched a calculated viral smear campaign to destroy my personal reputation and turn the entire family against me. They wanted to isolate me completely so I would have no support system when they finally moved to seize the estate. I watched the video twice, analyzing Courtney's performance with cold detachment. It was a brilliant move in the court of public opinion, but it was incredibly foolish in the realm of actual law. She was publicly documenting their intent to contest the will based on false allegations of elder abuse. I saved the video, downloaded all the comments, and forwarded the entire package to Mr. Harrison at the law firm to add to our growing file of evidence. My phone buzzed again with a new direct message. This one was from my mother, Catherine. It was not a plea for reconciliation or a demand for a family meeting. It was a declaration of absolute war. "We just filed the official paperwork to transfer the lake house deed to our name," the message read, the digital text practically dripping with her signature venom. Your father is taking control of the estate as he should have done years ago. Pack your trash and get out of that villa by tomorrow morning, or we will have the local police throw you out like a stray dog. Do not test us, Julia. You have already lost. Ew. I stared at the glowing screen of my phone, reading my mother's toxic message over and over. They had transferred the deed. It was an illegal move, but perfectly aligned with their desperate financial situation. I did not waste time crying or panicking. I closed my laptop, packed the physical evidence into a thick black binder, and marched out of my office. I needed to find them immediately. A search of my mother's public social media accounts gave me what I needed. She had posted a location tag 20 minutes ago. They were at the Oakwood Country Club hosting a private morning brunch in honor of my grandfather. I knew exactly what that meant. It was not a memorial. It was a stage. The Oakwood Country Club was an exclusive playground for the local elite, a sprawling estate with manicured golf courses. I pulled my modest sedan into a parking lot filled with luxury vehicles. I grabbed the heavy binder and walked straight past the valet. The grand foyer smelled of fresh lilies and expensive cologne. I moved with absolute purpose, ignoring the questioning look of the hostess. I knew the layout of this club perfectly. We had spent countless miserable Sunday afternoons here playing the perfect wealthy family, while my father networked with politicians and my mother judged the other wives. I walked toward the main dining terrace, where the most important guests were seated. The double glass doors were propped open, letting in the warm breeze and the sound of clinking crystal glasses. I stopped just outside the dining area, allowing myself a moment to survey the room before making my presence known. My parents had secured the largest table right in the center of the terrace. My sister Courtney was nowhere to be seen, presumably still recording her tearful videos for social media. Instead, my mother Catherine was holding court with a group of influential local women. I recognized the wife of a prominent judge and the spouse of a real estate developer. I stepped closer, hiding behind a potted palm to listen. My mother was dabbing her perfectly dry eyes with a linen napkin. "It has been an absolute nightmare," my mother told the women, her voice dripping with manufactured sorrow. "Poor Julia completely snapped after Henry passed away. She always had a fragile mind, you know. We had no choice but to admit her to a private psychiatric facility this morning. The doctors say she is completely delusional and suffering from severe paranoia. She is making up wild stories about the family finances. We are praying she gets the professional help she desperately needs." The other women murmured in sympathetic agreement, shaking their heads and offering hollow condolences. My mother was proactively destroying my credibility, ensuring that if I ever tried to expose my father's fraud, everyone would dismiss me as a mentally unstable woman having a breakdown. I shifted my gaze across the table to my father William. He was completely ignoring his grieving wife act. Instead, he was leaning aggressively across the table, speaking in hushed, urgent tones to Marcus Sterling. Marcus was an incredibly wealthy venture capitalist, known for backing high-risk commercial real estate projects. My father's face was flushed, and he was gesturing wildly with his hands. I could not hear his exact words over the ambient noise, but his body language screamed pure desperation. He was pitching Marcus hard, trying to secure a massive influx of cash to plug the gaping holes in his sinking company. He was using the illusion of his newly inherited wealth to bait a massive investor. The absolute hypocrisy of the scene filled me with a cold, sharp energy. They were eating expensive caviar and drinking imported champagne built entirely on lies while trying to destroy my life and steal my grandfather's legacy. It was time to shatter their beautiful, fragile glass house. I stepped out from behind the palm tree and walked directly onto the crowded dining terrace. I did not rush. I did not storm over like an angry child. I walked with the slow, measured pace of a woman who held every single card in the deck. My posture was perfectly straight, and my expression was entirely unreadable. Several heads turned as I passed the outer tables. People recognized me. They had just heard my mother loudly declare that I was locked away in a padded cell. Their conversations abruptly stopped, and a wave of heavy, awkward silence rippled across the terrace. I kept my eyes locked solely on my parents' table. My mother was the first to see me. She was in the middle of taking a sip from her mimosa. Her eyes went wide with pure terror, and she choked loudly, spilling a splash of orange liquid down the front of her expensive silk dress. "Julia," she gasped, her voice cracking. My father stopped his frantic pitching and whipped his head around. The color instantly drained from his face, leaving him looking pale and sickly. Marcus Sterling looked up at me with open confusion. I walked right up to the edge of their table. I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not offer a single word of greeting. I simply raised the thick black binder I was carrying and dropped it flat onto the center of my father's porcelain plate. The heavy thud echoed loudly across the silent terrace. The impact shattered his plate and sent shards of expensive china and bits of catered food flying across the pristine white tablecloth. Marcus Sterling jumped back in his chair to avoid the mess. "William, what is the meaning of this?" Marcus demanded, looking angrily at my father. My father scrambled to his feet, his face twisting into a mask of pure fury. "Julia, what is wrong with you?" he hissed, keeping his voice low to avoid drawing more attention. "You are making a terrible scene. You need to leave this club immediately before I have security drag you out." I ignored his threat completely and looked directly at the wealthy investor sitting across from him. "Mr. Sterling, I advise you to read the contents of that binder before you even consider giving this man a single penny of your investment capital," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the quiet dining area. My father lunged forward, trying to grab the binder, but I kept my hand pressed firmly down on the cover. "If you are so incredibly successful, Dad," I asked, projecting my voice so that every single person at the neighboring tables could hear me clearly, "why is your flagship real estate company currently defaulting on 3 massive commercial loans? Why have you been hiding massive revenue losses through illegal shell companies for the past 5 years? And why did you just forge a power of attorney document to illegally freeze my legitimate bank accounts this morning?" My mother leapt out of her chair, knocking her mimosa glass onto the floor. She rushed around the table and grabbed my upper arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging painfully into my skin. "Julia, stop this insane behavior right now," she hissed directly into my ear, her breath hot and frantic. "Everyone is staring at us. You are embarrassing the entire family. You are acting completely crazy, just like I told them. Come with me right now." I slowly turned my head to look at her. I did not break my stoic expression. I simply flexed my shoulder and forcefully shook her right hand off my arm. "Do not ever touch me again," I sternly warned her, my tone dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper. "I am not the crazy little daughter you can lock away in a hospital to protect your lies. I am the forensic auditor who just found the paper trail to your massive corporate fraud." The surrounding guests were now openly staring and whispering behind their hands. Marcus Sterling stood up, threw his napkin onto the table, and walked away without saying a single word. My father watched his last desperate chance at financial salvation disappear into the crowd. The veins in his neck were bulging and his breathing was heavy and ragged. He stood completely still for a long moment, staring down at the black binder resting in the ruins of his lunch. Then the most terrifying thing happened. The panic and the rage slowly melted away from his face. He recovered his composure, smoothed the lapels of his custom suit, and let out a dark, humorless laugh. He leaned across the table, closing the distance between us until he was inches from my face. He looked me dead in the eye and whispered so quietly that only I could hear him. "Those loans are backed by the lake house, Julia. The exact same house I just legally transferred to my own name this morning. Your little audit means absolutely nothing to me when I own the collateral and control your entire future." I shoved my chair back violently against the stone patio of the country club. I did not waste another second looking at my father and his smug, grinning face. I turned on my heel and power walked directly to my car. My mind raced rapidly as I navigated the winding local roads, heading straight north toward the Lake George villa. My grandfather had loved that property more than anything else in his vast portfolio. He built it with his own hands before he ever made his first million. There was absolutely no conceivable universe where he would have voluntarily signed the deed over to my father. He knew William was a reckless spender who had nearly bankrupted the family logistics firm twice. The tires of my sedan crunched loudly over the gravel driveway as I pulled through the towering wrought iron gates of the estate. The sweeping view of the pristine blue lake was completely eclipsed by the infuriating sight on the wraparound wooden porch. A heavy-duty commercial locksmith van was parked illegally on the front lawn, crushing my grandfather's prized hydrangeas. Standing on the porch directly in front of the massive oak double doors was my sister Courtney and her husband Jason. Jason was holding a cordless power drill, aggressively stripping the deadbolt right out of the mahogany frame. Leaning against the porch railing with a casually arrogant posture was Officer Miller. I recognized him instantly. He was a local precinct cop who spent more time drinking scotch and smoking expensive cigars on the golf course with my father than he ever did patrolling the actual streets. He was wearing his full uniform, but his attitude was entirely that of a hired private thug. I slammed my car into park and marched up the wide stone steps. My blood boiled, but I kept my breathing perfectly even and my facial expression carved from ice. I demanded to know exactly what they were doing to my property. Jason stopped drilling and turned around, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. He wore a designer polo shirt that stretched uncomfortably over his expanding waistline. He let out a loud, obnoxious laugh and tossed the heavy power drill onto a nearby wicker patio chair. He reached into his back pocket and pulled out a sharply creased piece of heavy stock legal paper. He snapped it open and thrust it aggressively into my face. "This is not your property, Julia," he sneered, his face turning a blotchy red. "It never was. William is the legal owner of this entire estate. He graciously authorized us to move in and act as the primary caretakers. We are just securing the premises from unwanted trespassers." He jabbed his thick finger against the bottom of the paper. I kept my hands firmly at my sides, refusing to snatch the document from his sweaty grip. I leaned forward and scanned the dense legal text. It was a standard property transfer deed. My eyes immediately dropped to the bottom right corner. There, sitting perfectly on the signature line, was my grandfather Henry's distinct looping autograph. Next to it was a date stamped in bold black ink. The date was exactly 1 day before the fatal plane crash. The sheer mathematical improbability of that timing screamed at my professional instincts. My grandfather had been in London securing a massive shipping contract the entire week before his flight. He had not been anywhere near my father or the state of New York to sign a physical property deed. This document was a blatant physical impossibility. I looked Jason dead in the eyes and told him the document was fraudulent. I informed him that my grandfather was entirely out of the country on that specific date, and that breaking and entering a private residence carried severe mandatory prison sentences. Courtney stepped out from behind her husband, clutching a massive cardboard box overflowing with items. She rolled her eyes and let out a dramatic, exaggerated sigh. "You are always so terribly dramatic, Julia," she whined. "Dad has the actual deed. The prominent lawyers processed it this morning. You are officially homeless right now." I opened my mouth to demand they vacate the porch immediately, but Officer Miller pushed himself off the wooden railing and stepped directly into my path. He rested his large right hand heavily on his thick black leather duty belt, allowing his fingers to brush against his holstered weapon in a clear, silent threat. "You need to listen to your sister," Miss Miller said, his voice laced with heavy condescension. "You are currently trespassing on private property. Mr. Wilson provided me with a verified digital copy of the deed this morning and asked me to personally ensure his daughter Courtney could secure the premises safely. You have exactly 30 seconds to turn around, walk back to your cheap little car, and drive away. If you refuse to comply with my direct lawful order, I will physically place you in handcuffs right now and arrest you for criminal trespassing and harassment." He took a heavy step forward, using his sheer physical size to try and intimidate me into submission. Courtney let out a sharp, high-pitched giggle. She stepped up to the edge of the porch, holding the large cardboard box over the railing. "Oh, I almost forgot," she mocked, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. We were clearing out the guest bedroom closets to make room for my new summer wardrobe. We found all your pathetic little sentimental trinkets. You should really take this garbage with you when you leave. Without waiting for a response, she violently shoved the box forward and tipped it upside down. Dozens of my childhood photo albums, delicate glass snow globes my grandfather had bought me from his business travels, and fragile hand-painted picture frames rained down onto the hard-packed gravel driveway. Glass shattered loudly. Photographs scattered across the dirt. I watched a picture of my grandfather and me at my college graduation flutter into a muddy puddle. Courtney laughed again, a cruel, hollow sound that echoed off the quiet lake water. She turned her back to me, grabbed Jason by the arm, and happily dragged him inside the house, stepping over the ruined lock mechanism on the floor. Officer Miller gave me one last warning glare before moving to stand directly in front of the open doorway, effectively blocking any attempt I could make to enter my own home. I did not scream. I did not give them the profound satisfaction of seeing me break down into hysterical tears. I slowly descended the stone steps and knelt down on the sharp gravel. I began gathering the scattered photographs and broken frames with steady, methodical movements. As I reached for a small silver frame, I noticed a piece of paper lying face down in the dirt right next to it. It was a secondary photocopy of the property deed Jason had just been waving aggressively in my face. He must have accidentally dropped it when he pulled the original document out of his pocket earlier. I picked up the paper and brushed the loose dirt from the surface. I stared at the signature at the bottom of the page. The sun was shining brightly over my shoulder, casting a harsh, revealing light directly onto the ink. In my decade as a forensic auditor, I had examined thousands of forged checks, tampered corporate ledgers, and fabricated financial contracts. My eyes were professionally trained to catch microscopic discrepancies that normal people simply glossed over. I brought the paper closer to my face, tracing the lines of the signature with my eyes. It was completely perfect. It was far too perfect. Human signatures are naturally dynamic. They have slight variations in pressure, minor hesitations, and fluid changes in ink density depending on the speed of the pen stroke. This signature had none of those natural human elements. The ink distribution was entirely flat and perfectly uniform across every single letter. The loops were totally rigid. It was not a signature written by a human hand. It was a precise mechanical tracing. It was an exact pixel-by-pixel copy. My mind instantly flashed back to a mundane moment 3 days ago. I had been sitting in my parents' kitchen while my mother, Catherine, frantically searched through her massive designer purse for her keys. A stack of folded papers had tumbled out onto the marble island counter. One of those papers had fallen open, revealing an old real estate contract from 10 years ago. It bore my grandfather's signature. I had stared at it for only a fraction of a second before she snatched it away. But my photographic memory had cataloged it perfectly. I stared down at the fraudulent deed in my hands. The signature on this fake property transfer was an exact mechanical copy of the signature from my mother's purse. It was a blatant, undeniable, and absolute criminal forgery. I slid the forged document safely into the inner pocket of my tailored blazer and backed slowly away from the sharp gravel driveway. Officer Miller was still standing casually on the expansive wooden porch, with his hand resting menacingly on his duty belt, waiting for me to make a wrong move. I gave him a cold, dismissive look before turning around and walking briskly to my car. Getting arrested for trespassing would completely derail my meticulously calculated plan. I needed a highly secure location, a stable internet connection, and absolute unbothered silence. I pulled out of the towering iron estate gates and drove exactly 12 miles south down the winding highway until I spotted a run-down roadside motel hidden behind a grove of dying pine trees. The red neon vacancy sign was flickering badly, and the cracked asphalt parking lot was mostly empty. It was the perfect place to disappear for a few critical hours. I paid for a corner room in cash using the fake corporate identity I always used when traveling for highly sensitive financial investigations. The dark room smelled intensely of stale cigarette smoke and cheap lemon bleach, but it had a small laminate desk bolted to the far wall. That was all I needed to initiate my counterattack. I locked the heavy wooden door, engaged the rusted metal deadbolt, and slid the brass security chain firmly into place. I pulled my high-performance laptop from my leather bag and booted up my encrypted mobile cellular hotspot. I laid the stolen photocopy of the fraudulent deed flat on the desk, under the harsh flickering glare of the single overhead lamp. My eyes bypassed the forged signature entirely. I had already visually confirmed the mechanical trace. I needed to know exactly who processed the illegal property transfer. I zoomed my phone camera in on the circular notary stamp pressed deeply into the bottom left corner of the document. The black ink was slightly smudged along the outer edge, but the printed name and registered license number were clearly legible. Arthur Pendleton. I opened my encrypted database access portal and ran a comprehensive state background check on the specific name. It took less than 40 seconds for the official results to populate on my bright screen. Arthur Pendleton was not an independent state-commissioned notary public. He was a senior payroll clerk directly employed full-time by Wilson Enterprises. My father had brazenly used his own internal staff member to illegally stamp a forged real estate transfer on the exact day my grandfather tragically died. It was incredibly sloppy and arrogant. It proved my father genuinely believed he was completely untouchable by standard law enforcement. But the fake deed was just a single dangling thread. I needed to pull the entire sweater apart piece by piece. I opened a secure virtual private network and tunneled directly into the public tax filings and internal corporate ledgers of Wilson Enterprises. I already knew my father was actively defaulting on 3 major commercial loans, but I needed to find out exactly where the original capital had mysteriously vanished over the last decade. My fingers flew across the backlit keyboard writing custom data extraction scripts to pull 5 continuous years of raw financial records. I meticulously organized the raw data into massive pivoting spreadsheets, searching for hidden mathematical patterns, offshore wire transfers, and deeply buried shell companies. What I uncovered over the next 3 grueling hours was a corporate conspiracy so deeply rooted and spectacularly brazen that it literally took my breath away. My parents did not just forge a single property deed to steal the Lake George villa. That was merely their desperate, frantic final act of survival. For the past 5 continuous years, William and Catherine had been systematically bleeding my grandfather's primary holding company completely dry. They had strategically set up a highly complex web of 7 different dummy corporations registered across Delaware and the Cayman Islands. They used these fake entities to generate thousands of fraudulent invoices for exorbitant consulting fees, material acquisitions, and logistical support that never actually existed in the real world. They seamlessly funneled the dirty money directly out of my grandfather's pristine accounts and washed it through their own failing business ventures. The total amount of embezzled funds was absolutely staggering. They had stolen exactly $15 million in cold hard cash. I ruthlessly traced the money flowing out of the offshore accounts and directly into my family's personal checking and savings accounts. The data told a pathetic story of unchecked greed and gross managerial incompetence. My father had used over $9 million to secretly prop up his collapsing commercial real estate projects in the city. He had purchased massive plots of environmentally unusable land and tried to illegally bribe local zoning officials, failing miserably at every single turn. He was bleeding cash rapidly and using my grandfather's hard-earned corporate empire to quietly cover his disastrous, expensive mistakes. The remaining $6 million went straight to funding the extravagant elite lifestyle my mother and sister paraded around the country club every single weekend. I found the exact electronic wire transfers that paid entirely for Courtney's custom-ordered Porsche Macan. I found the exorbitant monthly retainers for her personal wardrobe stylist and private hairdressers. I tracked the hundreds of thousands of dollars spent on first-class international flights, luxury private villas on the Amalfi Coast, and exclusive designer wardrobes that Catherine and Courtney constantly used to maintain their fake high society image. They were proudly parading around as elite wealthy socialites while entirely funding their pathetic existence through massive, unchecked corporate theft. They were absolutely nothing but high-priced criminal parasites draining the life out of a good man. I sat back in the cheap plastic chair and stared at the glowing columns of numbers on my laptop screen. A profound, chilling realization washed over me, making the hair on my arms stand straight up. My grandfather, Henry, was a brilliant self-made billionaire. He checked his own corporate ledgers meticulously every single quarter. There was absolutely no conceivable way $15 million could disappear from his primary holding companies without him noticing the massive financial discrepancy. I quickly pulled up the historical access logs for the primary holding company server. My forensic software immediately highlighted a series of internal audit requests initiated by my grandfather's personal administrative user account exactly 3 weeks before the fatal plane crash. He had specifically requested the exact same financial packets I was currently analyzing. He had painstakingly followed the exact same offshore money trail to the dummy corporations. Grandpa Henry knew absolutely everything. He had found the fake entities. He had tracked the fraudulent invoices to the penny. He knew his own son and daughter-in-law were systematically robbing him blind to fund their ridiculous vanity projects and failing commercial businesses. He knew Courtney was happily living off stolen money while treating everyone around her like absolute garbage. That was the exact specific reason he called Mr. Harrison to his private office and completely rewrote his last will and testament. He did not leave the entire $60 million estate to me out of simple grandfatherly favoritism. He left it to me because I was an elite, highly trained forensic auditor. He knew I was the only person in our entire bloodline who possessed the specific analytical skills required to uncover the highly complex embezzlement scheme. He knew I was the only person with the icy emotional detachment necessary to ruthlessly hold my parents accountable for their terrible crimes. He gave me the legal power and the massive financial resources to burn their fraudulent house of cards straight to the ground. The immense heavy weight of his final deliberate decision settled heavily on my shoulders. It was not just a generous inheritance, it was a strict mandate for absolute justice. I leaned forward and began rapidly downloading the entire mountain of digital evidence. I compiled the offshore bank statements, the fake consulting invoices, the routing numbers for Courtney's luxury purchases, and the definitive proof of the forged notary stamp into a single heavily encrypted master file. I needed to secure multiple redundant backups on physical drives before I took my next strategic step. The green loading bar on my screen slowly inched toward 99%. Suddenly, a violent crashing sound echoed through the small, dingy motel room. I jumped back in my chair as the heavy wooden door visibly bowed inward against the metal security frame. Someone was throwing their entire physical body weight against the exterior door, trying to forcefully break it open. The cheap interior drywall splintered loudly, and the metal security chain pulled dangerously tight against the loose wall screws. I slammed my laptop shut instantly and shoved it deeply into my protective leather briefcase. I stood up quickly and backed away from the entrance, looking around the cramped room for any possible defensive weapon or secondary escape route. The door rattled violently again, followed immediately by the sound of heavy fists pounding mercilessly against the painted wood. "Julia, open this door right now!" a man shouted loudly from the outside concrete walkway. The aggressive voice was completely unmistakable. It was Courtney's arrogant, entitled husband, Jason. He must have used a sophisticated GPS tracking application on my cell phone signal before I turned off my location services, or he simply paid off someone working at the front desk. I remained perfectly silent, gripping the thick handle of my briefcase with white knuckles. "William knows exactly what you are doing in there, Julia," Jason screamed, his voice muffled by the thick wood but practically vibrating with intense panic and raw aggression. "He got an automated security alert when you bypassed the corporate firewall. He knows you are digging through the private financial ledgers. You need to stop this right now before you ruin everything for all of us. You are completely out of your depth. Hand over the laptop and the hard drives right now, and we can make this entire problem go away quietly." The door groaned loudly as he kicked it hard right next to the brass doorknob. Give me the laptop right now, Julia, or I swear I will break this door down and take it from you myself. The wood around the deadbolt groaned. Jason slammed his heavy boot against the doorframe a second time, sending a shower of cheap white paint chips scattering across the stained motel carpet. You are making this so much worse for yourself, Julia, he yelled, his voice dripping with venomous arrogance. William has already drawn up the medical guardianship papers. We have a judge standing by who owes your father a massive political favor. If you do not slide that laptop under the door right now, we are bringing the police and a medical transport team. We will have you committed to a state psychiatric ward before the sun sets. We will legally seize every single asset you own because you are completely unfit to manage your own affairs. You will be locked in a sterile white room pumped full of heavy sedatives, and we will walk away with absolutely everything. I did not flinch. I did not bother responding to his intimidation tactics. My eyes remained locked on the glowing progress bar on my computer screen. 99.2%. The secure encrypted upload to my offshore cloud server was slow on the cheap motel internet connection, but it was moving. I watched the numerical data packets transferring the exact coordinates of their entire $15 million embezzlement scheme into an untouchable digital vault. 99.6%. Jason kicked the door again. The top metal hinge visibly popped, tearing away from the weakened drywall. The heavy door sagged inward, leaving a 1-inch gap along the top frame. I could hear his heavy, ragged breathing on the other side. You are a delusional spinster, Julia, he mocked, his voice dropping to a nasty, sinister tone. You actually thought you could outsmart William Wilson. He built a massive corporate empire while you were pushing around meaningless numbers. We own the local cops. We own the courts. We own the narrative. You have absolutely no way out of this room with that data. 99.9%, 100%, upload complete, verification protocols engaged. The data was safe. I closed my laptop, shoved it into my waterproof leather satchel, and slung the heavy strap securely across my chest. The door was going to fail completely on the very next strike. I needed a massive distraction to cover my exit. My eyes darted around the confined space and locked onto the cheap brass lamp bolted to the bedside table. It had a heavy, solid metal base. I grabbed the lamp by its tarnished neck, planting my feet firmly on the carpet, and ripped it straight out of the wall fixture. The power cord snapped with a sharp electrical hiss. I spun around and faced the ceiling. Right above the small kitchenette area sat an old industrial fire alarm pull station and a rusted commercial sprinkler head. Jason took a running start and slammed his full body weight against the door. The deadbolt ripped entirely through the splintered wood. The door flew open, crashing violently against the interior wall. In that exact fraction of a second, I swung the heavy brass lamp upward like a baseball bat. The solid metal base smashed directly into the thick glass of the fire alarm and instantly shattered the delicate red bulb of the overhead sprinkler system. The mechanical response was instantaneous and deafening. A piercing decibel siren erupted through the entire motel complex. Simultaneously, a torrential downpour of freezing, stagnant black water blasted out of the ceiling sprinkler system. The foul-smelling pressurized water hit Jason squarely in the face just as he stumbled into the room. He let out a shocked, high-pitched scream, throwing his hands up to protect his eyes from the deluge. He slipped blindly on the soaked carpet and crashed hard onto his knees, hitting the floor with a heavy thud. I did not waste a single precious millisecond gloating. I turned my back on his pathetic, struggling form, leaped onto the cheap mattress, and threw open the sliding bathroom window at the rear of the room. I hoisted my body over the aluminum frame, dropping down into the muddy alleyway behind the motel. I hit the ground in a practiced crouch, ignoring the sharp, painful sting radiating through my ankles. The blaring mechanical alarm masked the sound of my escape perfectly. I sprinted down the narrow, darkened alleyway, weaving past overflowing trash dumpsters and rusted chain-link fences. I did not stop running until I was 3 blocks away, blending seamlessly into the busy afternoon foot traffic of the adjoining commercial district. I walked briskly, keeping my head down and my breathing even, until I reached the secondary long-term parking garage where I had stashed my vehicle hours ago. I climbed into the driver's seat of my car and immediately locked the doors. My chest was heaving, but my mind was crystal clear. I pulled my secondary offline tablet from the hidden compartment under my seat and booted up the synchronized files I had just successfully rescued. The freezing water dripping from my jacket did not matter. The physical threat of Jason did not matter. The only thing that mattered was uncovering the final piece of the complex financial puzzle. The massive $15 million hole in my father's corporate ledger was not just a random act of unbridled greed. It was a desperate, frantic cover-up. I opened the cross-referenced debt obligations file and began tracing the exact destination of William's most recent cash influxes. The $15 million he had systematically stolen from my grandfather was gone burned on terrible business investments and Courtney's lavish, superficial lifestyle. But William was still somehow operating his failing logistics business. He had to be getting massive operational capital from somewhere else to keep the corporate lights on. I found the hidden financial source deeply buried under layers of convoluted corporate jargon and anonymous holding accounts. Vanguard Holdings. It was a ruthless, elite private equity firm known entirely for engaging in highly aggressive hostile corporate takeovers. Vanguard Holdings did not just lend money to struggling businesses, they actively preyed on desperate bleeding companies. They provided massive high-interest loans wrapped in predatory financial covenants designed specifically to force the unfortunate borrower into immediate default, so Vanguard could legally seize their valuable physical assets. My father had borrowed exactly $20 million directly from Vanguard Holdings just 6 months ago to keep Wilson Enterprises from publicly declaring total bankruptcy. And Vanguard required absolute ironclad physical collateral for a high-risk loan of that extreme magnitude. I opened the specific loan covenant agreement my father had signed with Vanguard. My blood ran cold as I read the explicit collateral terms. William had legally pledged the Lake George villa and my grandfather's entire surrounding estate as the sole physical collateral for the $20 million Vanguard loan. That was exactly why my father forged the property deed. That was exactly why Courtney and Jason were frantically changing the locks and aggressively claiming immediate ownership. They absolutely needed to prove to Vanguard Holdings that William legally owned the massive collateral he had fraudulently pledged. If Vanguard ever discovered that the collateral was a complete, total fabrication, that William Wilson had confidently pledged a historic property he did not legally own, their corporate executioners would descend upon him instantly. Vanguard would immediately call the massive loan due in full. They would aggressively seize every single remaining physical and liquid asset in the Wilson corporate portfolio. They would trigger a devastating cascade of cross-defaults that would bankrupt my father in a matter of days and send him to federal prison for committing wire fraud. My grandfather Henry had found out about the Vanguard loan. He had discovered that his own son was arrogantly using his beloved family estate to secure dirty money from corporate vultures. That was exactly why Henry changed his last will and testament. That was exactly why he left everything to me. He knew I would inevitably find the Vanguard connection and use it to destroy William completely. I closed the ledger file and opened a secure encrypted browser. I needed to know exactly who was running Vanguard Holdings. A quick targeted search brought up the primary corporate leadership profile, Alexander Pierce, the chief executive officer of Vanguard Holdings. The global financial press universally described him as a brilliant, merciless shark who never lost a high-stakes negotiation and absolutely ruined anyone who attempted to deceive him. He was a dangerous, calculating man who demanded total control and absolute financial transparency from his borrowers. He was the perfect weapon. I opened my encrypted email client and generated an untraceable routing address. I typed in Alexander Pierce's private corporate email address, which I had extracted from my father's stolen communication logs. I did not write a long emotional explanation about my terrible family. I did not plead for his sympathetic help or outline my personal drama. Men like Alexander Pierce only responded to raw power and hard, undeniable facts. I attached the high-resolution photograph of the forged property deed alongside the definitive legal proof of the falsified notary stamp. I included the exact banking routing numbers showing the $15 million my parents had successfully embezzled and subsequently burned on luxury garbage. I kept the message incredibly brief, professional, and absolutely lethal. I typed the final sentence feeling the satisfying weight of absolute justice resting at my fingertips. Your massive $15 million investment is entirely gone. I have the definitive legal proof. Meet me in 2 hours. I stepped out of the private elevator and onto the top floor of the Vanguard Holdings Tower in downtown Manhattan. The entire floor was a monument to clinical corporate power. Cold gray slate floors stretched out to meet floor-to-ceiling glass walls overlooking the sprawling city skyline. A sharp-looking executive assistant silently escorted me down the long corridor and opened the heavy glass door to the main boardroom. Alexander Pierce was sitting at the far end of a massive, polished obsidian table. He did not look up from the tablet in his hands as I walked into the room. He wore a dark bespoke suit and radiated absolute arrogant authority that only came from destroying rival corporations for a living. I placed my heavy leather briefcase on the table and took a seat directly across from him. Pierce finally looked up, his piercing blue eyes analyzing me with open disdain. "You have exactly 5 minutes, Miss Wilson," he said, his voice flat and completely devoid of basic professional courtesy. "Your email claimed my firm lost $15 million in a secured investment. I highly doubt a mid-level corporate accountant has uncovered something my elite risk analysts somehow missed. You are wasting my valuable time." I did not flinch at his condescending tone. I knew exactly how men like Alexander Pierce operated. They respected nothing but hard, undeniable data and absolute leverage. I opened my briefcase and pulled out my encrypted laptop. "I am an elite forensic auditor, Mr. Pierce," I replied, keeping my voice perfectly even and icy cold. "And your elite team of risk analysts just authorized a massive capital loan based entirely on a fabricated fairy tale." I connected my laptop to the boardroom projection system. The massive digital display at the far end of the boardroom flared to life. I brought up the primary master file I had secured during my narrow escape from the roadside motel. I did not bother with pleasantries or introductory slides. I went straight for the jugular. I displayed the official loan covenant Vanguard Holdings had executed with Wilson Enterprises 6 months ago. The document clearly outlined the $20 million cash injection secured by my grandfather's historic Lake George estate. I tapped my keyboard and split the screen, bringing up the fraudulent property deed my brother-in-law Jason had waved in my face just a few hours prior. "This is the collateral your risk management team blindly accepted," I stated, pointing to the high-resolution scan of the deed. "It looks perfectly legitimate to the untrained eye. However, I am going to show you exactly why your massive investment is currently backed by absolutely nothing." I zoomed in on my grandfather's signature at the bottom of the deed and simultaneously projected the secondary document I had extracted from my mother's purse. I ran my custom forensic overlay software, highlighting the exact pixel-by-pixel match between the two signatures. Human beings do not sign their names with microscopic mechanical perfection twice in a row, I explained, watching Pierce's eyes narrow as he studied the screen. "This is a digital trace, a complete forgery. My grandfather never signed this property transfer. He was physically in London on the date stamped next to his forged name. Your firm accepted stolen, unverified property as the sole collateral for a $20 million loan." Pierce sat up straight, his dismissive posture instantly vanishing. He placed his tablet face down on the obsidian table and stared intently at the overlapping signatures. The cold arrogance in his eyes was rapidly being replaced by a dark, dangerous fury. "You are accusing your own father of committing federal wire fraud to secure a Vanguard loan," Pierce asked, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "I am not simply accusing him, Mr. Pierce. I am proving it," I replied, tapping the keyboard again. The screen shifted to display the sprawling complex web of offshore dummy corporations. But forging the deed to the lake house was just his final desperate maneuver to secure your capital. I pulled up the internal ledgers of Wilson Enterprises side by side with my grandfather's primary holding company accounts. Over the past 5 years, William and Catherine Wilson systematically embezzled $15 million from my grandfather's legitimate trusts. They washed the dirty money through these 7 shell companies in Delaware and the Cayman Islands. I traced every single stolen dollar directly into their personal accounts. They used the stolen cash to prop up their completely bankrupt commercial real estate projects and fund my sister's lavish public lifestyle. Wilson Enterprises has zero actual liquidity. They are defaulting on 3 other commercial loans. Your $20 million investment went straight into a black hole. The silence in the boardroom was absolute. Alexander Pierce stared at the undeniable proof of his firm's massive financial exposure. The veins in his neck were visibly pulsing. He had built his entire terrifying reputation on being the smartest, most ruthless predator in the financial sector. Now he was staring at definitive proof that a desperate, incompetent man like my father had successfully played him for a fool. Pierce stood up and slowly walked toward the glowing projection screen, analyzing the offshore routing numbers. He crossed his arms over his chest and let out a sharp, humorless breath. "If what you are showing me is entirely accurate, Miss Wilson, your father has committed corporate suicide. I will have my legal team tear his company apart by tomorrow morning. I will seize every single asset he claims to own. I will personally ensure he spends the rest of his natural life in a federal penitentiary for defrauding Vanguard Holdings." I closed my laptop and folded my hands on top of the polished table. "That is exactly the problem, Mr. Pierce," I said, drawing his attention back to me. "If you trigger the default clauses right now and aggressively attack Wilson Enterprises, you will discover they have absolutely nothing left to seize. Their accounts are completely empty. The commercial properties they own are fully leveraged to other banks. And the lake house collateral is legally void. If you attack him directly, you will inevitably have to write off your entire $20 million investment as a total catastrophic loss. It will be a highly public, embarrassing failure for Vanguard Holdings." Pierce turned away from the screen and walked slowly back to his chair. He sat down and leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. He looked at me with a new, calculating respect. "You did not come here just to deliver bad news, Miss Wilson. You came here with a specific strategy. What exactly is your play?" I met his intense gaze without blinking. My grandfather discovered their massive embezzlement scheme right before he died. He knew they were draining the family holding companies to fund their fraudulent operations. That is why he secretly rewrote his entire will and left absolute control of the primary estate to me. I am the sole legal executor of his legitimate trusts. The trusts hold more than enough liquid capital to cover the debt my father owes you. I paused, letting the magnitude of my leverage sink in. Back my legal claim to the estate. Use Vanguard's massive corporate influence and aggressive legal resources to completely validate my position against my parents' hostile takeover attempts. Crush their forged deed in court. If you help me secure my rightful inheritance without a protracted legal battle, I will personally guarantee that your missing $15 million is returned to Vanguard in full from my grandfather's legitimate protected trusts. Pierce stared at me for a long, heavy moment, assessing the cold, calculated logic of my proposal. He knew I was offering him the only viable path to recover his seemingly doomed investment. "I want absolute assurance," he finally said, his voice turning deadly serious. "I want William and Catherine Wilson held fully accountable for their fraud. They tried to steal from me. I want them ruined." I nodded slowly, feeling the immense power of our new dark alliance. "We have an agreement, Mr. Pierce," I replied. "You will get your money, and they will lose absolutely everything." Suddenly, the harsh, vibrating sound of my cell phone shattered the quiet tension of the boardroom. I pulled the device from my jacket pocket. The screen displayed my father's name. I swiped to answer and placed the phone on the polished obsidian table, activating the speaker function. "Well, Julia," my father gloated, his voice echoing loudly across the large room, dripping with malicious triumph. The formal eviction notice is signed and legally processed. We are coming to the lake house tomorrow morning to clear out the rest of your grandfather's trash. Be there to hand over the trust codes, or we burn it all. I looked directly at Alexander Pierce, who was listening intently. I leaned closer to the phone. I will be there, I replied simply and ended the call. I slid the phone back into my tailored jacket pocket and looked across the massive obsidian table. Alexander Pierce was staring at me with a newfound expression of dark, calculating respect. He did not need to ask if I was serious. He saw the cold, absolute certainty in my eyes. We spent the next 20 minutes finalizing the exact logistical parameters of our arrangement. He would position his aggressive corporate legal team to strike at the exact moment I gave the signal. I walked out of the Vanguard Holdings Tower and stepped into the freezing Manhattan night. The city was alive with blaring sirens and blinding neon lights, but my mind was a fortress of absolute silence. I slid into the driver's seat of my car and merged onto the northbound interstate, heading straight toward the Adirondack Mountains. The highway stretched out before me like an endless ribbon of black asphalt. The steady, hypnotic rhythm of the tires humming against the road allowed my mind to process the sheer magnitude of the impending destruction. I thought about my grandfather Henry. I thought about the decades of blood and sweat he sacrificed to build a pristine corporate empire. I thought about his quiet dignity. I thought about his unwavering principles. I thought about his profound, devastating disappointment when he finally realized his own flesh and blood were nothing but parasitic thieves. Every fraudulent invoice they created, every offshore account they opened, every stolen dollar they used to fund their pathetic superficial existence. It was all a calculated insult to his legacy. They wanted a victim. They wanted a tragedy. They wanted a quiet surrender. They were going to get an absolute massacre instead. I drove for 3 hours into the deep, impenetrable darkness of upstate New York. I needed to make one final critical stop before returning to the Lake George estate. I saw the flickering red neon sign of a rundown 24-hour diner illuminating the tree line. I pulled my vehicle into the empty, cracked asphalt parking lot and parked in the darkest corner away from the harsh overhead street lamps. The diner smelled heavily of stale frying oil and burnt filter coffee. I slid into a cracked red vinyl booth at the very back facing the entrance. I ordered a black coffee from a tired-looking waitress and opened my encrypted laptop. I had Vanguard Holdings ready to trigger the financial execution. Now I needed the ultimate legal authority to drop the final heavy cage over William Wilson. During my extensive career as an elite forensic auditor, I had cultivated a highly specialized network of law enforcement contacts. I had worked alongside some of the most aggressive federal investigators in the country, dismantling complex corporate fraud rings. I knew exactly who had been quietly circling my father's collapsing empire for the past 14 months. Special Agent Thomas Reynolds. He was a veteran investigator for the Federal Bureau of Investigation, specifically assigned to the Elite Financial Crimes Unit in the New York field office. I opened a secure satellite connection and dialed his direct encrypted line. He answered on the second ring, his voice sharp and instantly alert despite the late hour. I did not waste his time with pleasantries. I told him exactly who I was. I told him I had the definitive missing link to the Wilson Enterprises investigation. I told him I possessed the unredacted internal ledgers, the verified offshore routing numbers, and the undeniable physical proof of federal wire fraud. I could hear the immediate shift in his breathing over the encrypted line. Agent Reynolds had been desperately trying to nail William for months, but he had consistently hit a massive brick wall of Cayman Island privacy laws and shell company misdirection. He lacked the internal origin points. He lacked the unencrypted metadata. He lacked the smoking gun. I gave him the address of the roadside diner. He told me he was currently operating out of the Albany field office and would be sitting across from me in exactly 40 minutes. I drank my bitter black coffee and watched the headlights of passing transport trucks sweep across the diner windows. Exactly 38 minutes later, a dark, unmarked federal sedan pulled into the parking lot. Special Agent Reynolds walked through the glass doors. He wore a rumpled gray trench coat over a dark suit. He had sharp, intelligent eyes that immediately scanned the perimeter of the room before locking onto my booth. He slid into the vinyl seat across from me and placed a leather notebook on the sticky table. He looked at me with a mixture of intense professional curiosity and deep cautious skepticism. "You made some massive promises on a highly secure federal line, Miss Wilson," he said, his voice a low, commanding baritone. "You claim to have the exact internal ledgers we have been trying to subpoena for over a year. Your father has a team of highly paid corporate defense attorneys fighting us at every single jurisdictional level. Why are you suddenly offering to hand him over to the federal government on a silver platter?" I did not answer him with words. I turned my laptop screen around so it faced him directly. I had preloaded the comprehensive forensic audit I had extracted from the holding company servers. I handed him a small, heavily encrypted titanium flash drive containing the complete mirrored backup of the entire $15 million embezzlement scheme. "Look at the screen, Agent Reynolds," I instructed, keeping my voice perfectly calm and detached. "I am not just giving you the internal ledgers. I am giving you the exact chronological roadmap of their entire criminal enterprise." I walked him through the data packet by packet. I showed him the initial fraudulent consulting invoices William generated 5 years ago. I showed him the systematic diversion of capital from my grandfather's legitimate trusts. I showed him the specific routing protocols used to wash the stolen money through the 7 Delaware shell corporations. I showed him the exact luxury purchases my mother and sister made using the embezzled funds. Every custom vehicle, every designer wardrobe, every extravagant international vacation. Agent Reynolds stared at the glowing columns of numbers. He scrolled through the undeniable digital proof. The skepticism in his eyes completely vanished, replaced by the sharp, predatory focus of a federal investigator staring at a perfectly constructed conviction. "This is a flawless forensic reconstruction," he murmured, his eyes darting across the screen. We knew he was bleeding the primary company dry, but we could not legally pierce the offshore corporate veils to prove the direct transfer of funds. "You have handed us the entire underlying architecture of a massive wire fraud conspiracy. This alone is enough to secure a federal indictment by tomorrow afternoon." "I am not finished," I stated coldly. I tapped the keyboard and brought up the high-resolution scan of the forged property deed alongside the Vanguard Holdings loan covenant. I explained the exact timeline of my grandfather's death and my father's immediate desperate panic. I showed him the falsified notary stamp belonging to Arthur Pendleton. I explained how William had aggressively leveraged a historic family estate he did not legally own to secure a $20 million private equity loan from Vanguard Holdings. I outlined how Courtney and Jason were actively using this forged legal document to claim immediate physical ownership of the property. Agent Reynolds leaned back against the red vinyl booth. He let out a long, slow breath, shaking his head in absolute disbelief. He committed massive bank fraud against one of the most notoriously aggressive private equity firms on the planet. He said, his tone reflecting a mixture of professional awe and utter disgust. "William Wilson is a dead man walking. I can have a federal strike team at his corporate headquarters by dawn. We can seize the servers and freeze every single remaining asset before he even finishes his morning coffee." I reached across the table and placed my hand flat on the titanium flash drive. "No," I said, my voice dropping to a hard, uncompromising pitch. "You are not going to his corporate headquarters. You are not going to tip him off. We are going to execute a perfectly coordinated trap. William and Catherine think they have won. They think they have successfully intimidated me into absolute submission. They are arriving at the Lake George estate tomorrow morning with their forged property deed and their private security contractors. They intend to forcefully evict me and illegally claim the property in front of the local authorities." I laid out the precise parameters of the final execution. I had Alexander Pierce and Vanguard Holdings ready to drop the financial hammer. I had the complete forensic proof of their embezzlement safely secured. Now I needed the federal government waiting patiently in the shadows. I told Agent Reynolds to assemble his tactical team. I told him to let William Wilson walk onto the pristine grounds of my grandfather's estate. We needed to let him confidently present that forged, fraudulent deed to sworn law enforcement officers. We needed to let him commit one final, undeniable, brazen act of federal fraud in broad daylight, with multiple federal witnesses actively watching. Once he legally presented that forged document to claim the property, the trap would snap completely shut. Agent Reynolds looked at me with a profound understanding. He recognized the poetic absolute justice of the strategy. You want to destroy his entire legacy in front of the very property he tried to steal? Reynolds said, a slow, sharp smile touching the corners of his mouth. You want him to feel the exact moment the steel trap closes around his neck. I will have 2 tactical units positioned in the heavy timber surrounding the main driveway. We will let him hang himself with his own arrogant rope. We finalized the communication protocols, and I walked out of the diner. I drove the final winding miles through the dark, silent mountains. I pulled through the towering iron gates of the Lake George estate and parked on the sharp gravel driveway. I did not sleep. I walked through the dark, empty halls of the massive villa, feeling the profound, heavy presence of my grandfather's legacy surrounding me. I stood perfectly still, letting the silence fortify my resolve. Dawn broke over the pristine, glassy waters of Lake George. The sky bled from an inky black into brilliant shades of deep violet and burning crimson. The morning mist rolled slowly across the surface of the lake, clinging to the heavy pine trees. I stood completely alone on the expansive wooden porch of the main villa. The cold morning air filled my lungs. I was wearing a tailored dark suit. I held a ceramic mug sipping bitter black coffee. The silence of the remote mountain estate was absolute and heavy with anticipation. Then the distinct violent sound of heavy rubber tires crunching aggressively on the sharp gravel echoed in the distance. The sound grew louder, echoing through the dense tree line. I lowered my coffee mug and looked toward the iron gates. A sleek black luxury SUV, followed closely by 2 heavy private security transport vehicles, turned onto the main driveway. The vehicles rolled aggressively toward the villa, kicking up thick clouds of gray dust. They parked in a jagged, aggressive line directly in front of the wooden porch. The heavy car doors slammed open simultaneously. The convoy had arrived. The final execution was about to begin. I stood my ground, waiting for my father to step out and seal his own absolute destruction. The dense, thick cloud of choking gray dust slowly settled over the meticulously manicured gravel driveway, revealing the sheer, staggering arrogance of my family's invasion. The lead, pristine black Mercedes SUV belonged to my father. Behind it sat Courtney's expensive white Porsche Macan, the exact vehicle purchased with my grandfather's stolen money. The final vehicle, dragging heavily up the winding mountain road, was a massive rusted box truck bearing the faded, peeling logo of a cheap local moving company. 2 burly men in stained work shirts jumped down from the truck, stretching their arms and looking around the sprawling historic estate with eager, greedy eyes. My father William stepped out of the driver's side of the Mercedes first, buttoning his impeccably tailored gray suit jacket with a look of supreme, unearned confidence. He looked up at me standing alone on the elevated porch, and a dark, cruel smile spread slowly across his sharp face. My mother, Catherine, emerged from the passenger side, wearing a pristine white cashmere coat and oversized dark designer sunglasses. She looked at the historic stone villa, not with reverence for the great man who built it from nothing, but with the hungry, calculating stare of a starving vulture picking over a fresh corporate carcass. Courtney and Jason practically skipped out of the Porsche, their faces flushed with greedy anticipation. Jason still looked slightly bruised and thoroughly exhausted from his miserable, pathetic failure at the roadside motel yesterday, but his arrogant, entitled sneer returned the absolute second he saw my father taking total charge of the situation. Finally, the heavy passenger door of the Mercedes opened again. Officer Miller stepped out, resting his hand heavily on his black leather duty belt, just as he had done the day before. He wore the standard uniform of the local municipal police department, but he moved with the sloppy, arrogant swagger of a privately hired thug. He adjusted his dark mirrored aviator glasses and tipped his uniform cap respectfully at my father, confirming his complete, total submission to the Wilson family payroll. The entire group moved forward as a single unified front of entitlement and greed, marching aggressively up the wide stone pathway toward the porch steps. They completely ignored the stunning natural beauty of the clear lake, reflecting the bright morning sun. Their eyes were locked entirely on the massive stone columns and the heavy antique oak doors of the villa. They were ready to violently strip the property bare. I remained perfectly still on the expansive wooden porch holding my ceramic coffee mug. I did not retreat a single inch. My mother reached the top of the wooden stairs, first her expensive designer heels clicking sharply against the timber. She did not say a single word of greeting. She did not offer a single fleeting moment of maternal hesitation. She marched directly up to me, raised her right hand high, and struck me across the face with absolutely everything she had. The brutal slap echoed loudly across the quiet morning lake, sounding like a sudden gunshot. The heavy diamond ring on her finger scraped violently against my cheekbone, leaving a hot, stinging trail of broken, bleeding skin. "You ungrateful wretch!" Catherine screamed, her voice shrill and vibrating with intense, hysterical rage. "I told you that you are nothing but a total failure. You actually thought you could lock us out of our own property. This house belongs to us." I slowly turned my face back to look directly at her. I did not raise my hand to touch the bleeding scratch on my cheek. I did not blink. My absolute icy silence seemed to deeply unnerve her for a fraction of a second, but she quickly covered her hesitation by stepping back and adjusting the collar of her pristine cashmere coat. Courtney pushed past our mother, giggling with malicious delight. She looked me up and down with intense, undisguised disgust before turning her attention to the burly movers standing awkwardly at the bottom of the porch stairs. "Ignore her," Courtney commanded, waving her hand dismissively in my direction. "Go straight through the main doors. I want the 18th century solid mahogany dining table loaded into the truck first, then go up to the master suite and pack all the antique silver pieces. Be extremely careful with the crystal chandeliers in the foyer. If you break anything, you are paying for it out of your miserable hourly wages." The movers nodded and lumbered heavily up the wooden steps, squeezing past me to breach the heavy oak doors of the villa. They were treating my grandfather's sacred home like an abandoned, cheap storage unit ready to be violently plundered. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my black coffee, relishing the bitter, scalding heat against my tongue. I calmly lowered the mug and checked my stainless wristwatch. 6:45 in the morning. Agent Reynolds and his heavily armed tactical teams were already in position, perfectly concealed within the dense timberline. The trap was fully primed. I just needed William to step directly onto the trigger. My father walked up the porch steps, his polished leather shoes striking the wood with heavy, deliberate authority. He pulled a thick manila folder from his jacket pocket and slapped it violently against my chest, forcing me to catch it before it hit the floor. "The time for your pathetic little rebellion is officially over, Julia." William stated, his voice dripping with intense condescension and absolute unshakable certainty. "Inside that folder is a binding legal transfer document. It permanently signs over your entire fraudulent claim to the $60 million primary trust back to Wilson Enterprises, where it rightfully belongs." I slowly opened the thick manila folder. The document was a masterpiece of aggressive, predatory legal drafting. It completely stripped me of every single right, protection, and asset my grandfather had deliberately assigned to me. It required a single notarized signature at the bottom of the final page to execute the total, irreversible surrender of my entire inheritance. I looked up from the dense legal text and met my father's dark, arrogant eyes. And if I refused to sign this ridiculous piece of paper, I asked, my voice perfectly calm and completely devoid of any recognizable fear. William smirked confidently, gesturing broadly to the corrupt police officer standing lazily at the bottom of the porch steps. "Then we do this the hard way," my father replied smoothly, his tone echoing absolute finality. "Officer Miller here has an executed legal warrant for your immediate arrest. The criminal charges are felony trespassing, malicious destruction of private property, and corporate espionage. The local municipal judge was completely appalled by your erratic, dangerous behavior. You sign that document right now, and transfer the secure trust codes, or you leave this property in handcuffs. You will sit rotting in a cold holding cell while we clear out this useless trash and take exactly what is ours." Jason stepped up closely beside my father, crossing his arms over his chest and grinning maliciously. "We warned you," Julia Jason mocked aggressively, rubbing his deeply bruised jaw. "We told you we would crush you if you tried to fight us. Now you have absolutely nothing left. Sign the paper and maybe William will generously let you keep your cheap little apartment in the city." The sheer staggering audacity of their collective delusion was almost magnificent to witness. They were standing directly on top of a massive powder keg of federal indictments and aggressively demanding I hand them the lit matches. I pulled the heavy gold-plated pen from the inner pocket of my tailored blazer. I took the heavy pen and twirled it smoothly between my fingers, letting the bright morning sunlight catch the polished, gleaming metal. I did not look at my father. I did not look at my mother, or my giggling entitled sister. I turned my absolute undivided piercing attention directly to Officer Miller, who was already reaching down to unclip the heavy steel handcuffs from his black leather duty belt. I locked eyes with the corrupt cop, projecting an aura of total chilling authority that made him freeze completely mid-motion. "Are you absolutely certain you want to execute a forged warrant on a property you do not have legal jurisdiction over?" I asked, my voice cutting through the crisp morning air like a newly sharpened steel blade. Officer Miller sneered, his face flushing bright red with sudden defensive indignant anger. He took a heavy aggressive step up the wooden stairs, his hand closing firmly around the cold metal cuffs, preparing to strike. "I do not take orders from crazy women trespassing on private property," he barked aggressively, stepping closer. "Put your hands behind your back right now." I did not move a single inch. I did not flinch or blink in the face of his pathetic, hollow intimidation. I simply maintained my icy composure, reached into my tailored blazer pocket, and calmly pulled out my mobile phone. I did not break eye contact with Officer Miller as my thumb brushed against the smooth glass screen of my mobile phone. The heavy morning air was thick with the scent of damp pine needles and the exhaust fumes from my father's idling Mercedes. Miller let out a harsh barking laugh, shaking his head in mock pity as he unlatched the heavy steel handcuffs from his black leather duty belt. My mother stood behind him, adjusting her pristine white cashmere coat and smiling with supreme arrogant satisfaction. She actually believed I was bluffing. She truly believed that after 5 years of systemic financial abuse and a lifetime of psychological torment, she was going to comfortably walk away with my grandfather's entire legacy. Courtney was busy snapping her fingers at the two burly movers pointing aggressively toward the massive antique oak front doors. The movers hesitated, shifting their weight awkwardly on the wooden steps, clearly sensing the escalating tension radiating across the porch. I ignored all of them. I bypassed the standard lock screen and pressed the single-speed dial contact I had programmed the night before. I did not raise the phone to my ear. I did not scream for help. I did not beg for mercy or attempt to negotiate with the criminals standing on my front porch. I simply held the phone perfectly flat in the palm of my hand, staring directly into my father's dark, calculating eyes. The call connected instantly with a sharp digital click, echoing loudly in the quiet morning air. I spoke 3 quiet words into the receiver. "You can come in." I ended the call and smoothly slid the phone back into my tailored blazer pocket. The absolute stillness that followed my statement was deafening. Officer Miller took another aggressive step forward, resting his heavy black boots on the top wooden stair. He let out another loud, obnoxious laugh, waving the steel handcuffs in the air. "Who exactly do you think you are calling, little girl?" He mocked, his voice dripping with condescending local authority. "Do you think calling your corporate lawyer is going to stop a municipal eviction warrant? I know the local judge. I know the local chief of police. Your father practically owns this entire county. Nobody is coming to save you from a legitimate court order." William stepped up beside the corrupt officer, crossing his arms over his expensive gray suit. "Stop playing these pathetic, theatrical games, Julia," my father demanded, his voice tight with growing irritation. "You are embarrassing yourself. You have absolutely no leverage left. Sign the trust transfer documents and hand over the security codes right now, or Officer Miller is going to forcefully physically remove you from this property." Catherine scoffed loudly from the driveway, crossing her arms and shaking her head. "She is just stalling, William," my mother complained bitterly. "She always was a dramatic, stubborn child. Just arrest her and let the movers get to work before the antique dealers arrive this afternoon." Courtney giggled again, pulling out her own phone to record my impending humiliation. Jason stood beside her, rubbing his bruised jaw and grinning with malicious anticipation. I remained perfectly, completely still. I did not say a single word. I simply looked past them, fixing my gaze on the dense, towering pine trees lining the long, winding driveway leading up to the main iron gates. The silence stretched for another 5 agonized seconds. And then the quiet, peaceful morning was violently shattered. It started as a low, distant mechanical rumble vibrating deep within the earth. The sound rapidly amplified, transforming into a deafening, synchronized roar of massive, high-performance engines pushing their limits. My father frowned, turning his head slightly toward the tree line. Officer Miller stopped laughing, his hands freezing mid-air. Courtney lowered her phone, her arrogant smile faltering as the heavy crunch of gravel grew exponentially louder. 3 massive black armored government SUVs tore violently through the front gates. They did not slow down. They did not announce their presence with sirens or flashing lights. They moved with terrifying, absolute tactical precision. The heavy armored vehicles roared up the long circular driveway, sending massive blinding clouds of gray dust and sharp gravel spraying into the air. The lead SUV slammed on its heavy brakes, executing a sharp, aggressive tactical maneuver that completely blocked the front exit of the driveway. The second armored vehicle slid perfectly into place directly behind William's pristine Mercedes, completely pinning it against the thick stone retaining wall. The third SUV boxed in the rusted moving truck, trapping the 2 burly movers precisely where they stood. The sheer sudden violence of the coordinated vehicular assault left my family completely paralyzed with absolute total shock. But the real display of power was just arriving. Gliding smoothly, silently, and effortlessly through the lingering cloud of thick gray dust was a custom elongated black Maybach. The ultra-luxury vehicle moved like a sleek, predatory shark, navigating through a chaotic school of panicking fish. The Maybach slid perfectly into the single remaining open space at the base of the wooden porch steps directly facing my father. The deep tinted windows completely obscured the interior, but the sheer, undeniable corporate menace radiating from the vehicle was palpable. The shift in power was instantaneous and absolutely devastating. The heavy reinforced doors of the 3 black armored SUVs flew open simultaneously in perfect military synchronization. 12 heavily armed federal agents stepped out onto the gravel. They moved with swift, terrifying efficiency, wearing dark tactical gear, heavy Kevlar vests, and dark windbreakers, emblazoned with the bright yellow letters FBI across their backs and chests. Several agents were carrying submachine guns, holding them at the ready, as they rapidly secured the entire perimeter of the villa. "Secure the vehicles," a loud, commanding voice echoed across the courtyard. "Nobody moves a single inch." My family froze in absolute, unadulterated terror. The arrogant, smug smirks completely vanished from their faces, replaced by an expression of pure, overwhelming panic. Catherine let out a sharp, terrified gasp, dropping her expensive designer handbag directly into the dirt. The bag tipped over, spilling cosmetics and gold credit cards onto the sharp gravel, but she did not even notice. Jason stumbled backward, tripping over his own feet and crashing hard into the side of Courtney's white Porsche. Courtney stood completely paralyzed, her phone slipping from her trembling fingers and shattering the glass screen on the rocks below. The 2 burly movers immediately dropped their heavy equipment, raising their hands high into the air and backing slowly away from the house, wanting absolutely no part of a federal raid. But the most satisfying reaction belonged to Officer Miller, the corrupt, arrogant local cop who had confidently threatened to lock me in a psychiatric ward just moments ago, suddenly realized the catastrophic magnitude of his terrible mistake. He looked at the dozen heavily armed federal agents surrounding the property. He looked at the bright yellow FBI lettering. All the blood instantly drained from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified chalk-white ghost. The steel handcuffs slipped from his trembling, sweaty fingers and hit the wooden porch steps with a loud metallic clatter. He did not attempt to reach for his service weapon. He did not attempt to assert his local municipal authority. He immediately dropped to his knees, raising his hands high above his head in an act of total, pathetic, unconditional surrender. He knew exactly what was happening. He had foolishly walked directly into a massive coordinated federal sting operation, and his entire corrupt career was permanently over. William Wilson remained standing at the bottom of the porch steps, his entire body completely rigid. His impeccably tailored gray suit suddenly looked entirely out of place against the backdrop of tactical assault rifles and federal agents. He stared wildly at the black SUVs, his mind desperately, frantically trying to comprehend how his perfect, infallible plan had collapsed so spectacularly. He looked up at me standing calmly on the porch, and the first genuine spark of true, undeniable fear flashed in his dark eyes. The rear passenger door of the lead armored SUV opened. Special Agent Thomas Reynolds stepped out onto the gravel. He wore a sharp, dark suit under a long charcoal trench coat, his federal badge clearly visibly clipped to his belt. He did not look at my father or my terrified mother. He walked with long, purposeful strides directly up the wooden porch steps, his polished shoes stepping casually over the discarded steel handcuffs left by the trembling corrupt officer. Agent Reynolds stopped when he reached my position and turned smoothly, standing exactly to my right. He crossed his hands in front of him, surveying the chaotic, terrified scene in the driveway with the cold, detached satisfaction of a hunter who had successfully trapped his prey. Simultaneously, the heavy rear door of the custom Maybach swung open. Alexander Pierce stepped out into the bright morning sunlight. He was dressed in a flawless, midnight blue bespoke suit that radiated absolute wealth and uncompromising power. He buttoned his jacket with a single fluid motion, looking around the historic estate with an expression of calm, aristocratic ownership. He ignored the federal agents securing the perimeter. He ignored Catherine weeping silently by the Mercedes. He ignored Jason cowering against the Porsche. Pierce walked up the wooden porch steps, his presence alone seeming to drop the temperature of the morning air. He reached my position and stopped standing exactly to my left. He adjusted the pristine cuffs of his tailored suit and looked down at my father with absolute blistering contempt. I stood perfectly centered between the two most dangerous men in the entire financial and legal world. On my right stood the absolute authority of the federal government, ready to dismantle my family's criminal enterprise piece by piece. On my left stood the apex predator of the global private equity sector, ready to violently collect his massive debt and destroy their corporate legacy. I had not just survived their pathetic eviction attempt. I had orchestrated their absolute total annihilation. My father stood at the bottom of the stairs, completely surrounded and utterly defeated. His eyes darted frantically from the federal badge clipped to Agent Reynolds' belt, directly to the cold, merciless face of the billionaire CEO he had foolishly attempted to defraud. William's mouth opened and closed several times, struggling to process the impossible reality standing on the porch above him. The color had completely vanished from his face, leaving him looking old, weak, and incredibly pathetic. He swallowed hard, his arrogant posture completely collapsing as the true staggering weight of his impending destruction finally crushed him. "Alexander?" My father stammered, his voice weak, trembling, and completely stripped of its usual commanding authority. "Alexander, what are you doing here?" William stood at the bottom of the wooden porch steps, completely paralyzed. The arrogant smirk that had defined his entire existence was entirely gone, replaced by a mask of sheer, unadulterated terror. He looked at Alexander Pierce, the legendary apex predator of the global private equity sector, standing shoulder to shoulder with the daughter he had just called a total failure. William opened his mouth to speak, but his vocal cords completely failed him. He swallowed hard, the Adam's apple bobbing in his throat as a cold sweat broke out across his pale forehead. He managed to stammer out Pierce's name again, his voice sounding thin and weak against the backdrop of the heavily armed federal agents securing the perimeter of the estate. Alexander Pierce looked down at my father with a level of absolute profound disgust that could freeze boiling water. Pierce adjusted the cuffs of his bespoke midnight blue suit with terrifying calm. "You actually thought you could defraud Vanguard Holdings?" William Pierce asked, his voice a low, lethal baritone that carried easily across the crisp morning air. "You truly believed you possessed the intellectual capacity to walk into my boardroom, present a forged property deed, and leverage a historic family estate you do not legally own to secure a $20 million cash injection. You took my capital and immediately funneled it into the massive gaping black hole of your bankrupt commercial real estate projects. You assumed I was just another gullible banker you could easily manipulate with a fabricated balance sheet and a stolen signature." William took a trembling step backward, bumping into the hood of his pristine Mercedes SUV. "Alexander." "Please, William," begged, raising his hands in a pathetic gesture of surrender. "There has been a massive misunderstanding. The legal paperwork was simply delayed. I can explain everything if we just step inside and discuss this privately like gentlemen." "We are completely finished having private discussions," William Pierce replied, his tone echoing with absolute finality. "I do not negotiate with desperate, incompetent thieves who forge documents to steal my firm's capital. I came here this morning for one specific reason. I came to watch the federal government completely dismantle your fraudulent empire. I am here because your daughter, Ms. Julia Wilson, is my newest and undeniably my most valuable corporate partner." She walked into my headquarters and handed me the exact forensic roadmap of your entire criminal enterprise. She guaranteed the full return of my $20 million investment directly from the legitimate protected trusts. In exchange, I guaranteed her the full devastating weight of my corporate legal team to ensure you lose absolutely everything. The color completely drained from Catherine's face. She stood frozen beside the Mercedes, her perfectly manicured hands trembling violently. Courtney let out a sharp, terrified gasp, her eyes darting frantically between the federal agents holding tactical rifles and the cold, merciless expression on Alexander Pierce's face. The reality of their impending destruction was finally crashing down upon them, crushing their fragile delusions of superiority into absolute dust. Special Agent Thomas Reynolds stepped forward, moving with swift, commanding authority. He walked directly down the wooden porch steps, closing the distance between himself and my trembling father. Reynolds reached out and snatched the thick manila folder straight out of William's shaking hands. The federal agent opened the folder, glanced briefly at the predatory trust transfer document, and let out a sharp, humorless laugh. He casually tossed the fraudulent legal contract onto the sharp gravel near my father's expensive leather shoes. "William and Catherine Wilson," Agent Reynolds announced, his voice booming with the undeniable power of the federal government. "You are both officially under arrest. The charges include federal wire fraud, criminal tax evasion, the forgery of legal property documents, and the systemic malicious embezzlement of $15 million from the primary holding trusts of the late Henry Wilson." My father's knees buckled. He grabbed the side mirror of his vehicle to stop himself from collapsing completely onto the driveway. He looked around wildly like a trapped animal desperately searching for an escape route that simply did not exist. The heavily armed agents tightened their perimeter, forming an impenetrable wall of black tactical gear around the vehicles. Agent Reynolds pulled a set of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. "We have already executed simultaneous federal search warrants at your corporate headquarters and your primary residential properties." Reynolds continued, taking a deliberate step toward William. "We have successfully seized all your private servers. We have legally frozen your domestic bank accounts. We have the complete unredacted routing numbers for the 7 offshore shell companies you established in Delaware and the Cayman Islands. We know exactly where you hid the stolen money, and we have already initiated the legal asset forfeiture protocols. Your company is dead, your finances are gone. Catherine shrieked. The sound was a piercing, hysterical wail of pure narcissistic collapse. She lunged forward, her expensive white cashmere coat flying open as she desperately grabbed the sleeve of my tailored blazer. "Julia, tell them this is a mistake!" Catherine screamed, her voice cracking with sheer absolute panic. "Tell these federal agents that we were just having a family dispute over the property lines. Tell them you authorized those financial transfers. You have to fix this right now. You cannot let them take our money. You cannot let them put your own mother in a federal prison. We are your family." I looked down at the woman who had slapped me across the face mere minutes ago. I looked at the woman who had spent 34 years treating my very existence as a profound personal insult. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I did not feel a single drop of daughterly obligation. I felt nothing but cold, satisfying closure. I calmly reached down and forcibly removed her trembling manicured fingers from my jacket sleeve. "There is absolutely no mistake, Catherine," I stated, my voice dripping with pure, freezing ice. "I am not going to save you. I am not going to lie to the Federal Bureau of Investigation to protect the parasitic thieves who destroyed my grandfather's legacy. Grandpa Henry knew exactly what you were doing. He discovered your massive embezzlement scheme right before his heart failed. He spent his final months tracing the stolen capital, watching his own son bleed the family empire dry to fund your pathetic, superficial lifestyle." Catherine shook her head violently, tears of pure terror ruining her expensive makeup. "No, he did not know anything," she sobbed uncontrollably, taking a stumbling step backward. "He was an old, foolish man. He trusted William to handle the accounts." "He trusted no one," I countered, taking a dominant step forward and forcing her to retreat. "He knew you were stealing the $15 million. He knew you were washing the capital through dummy corporations. That is exactly why he secretly contacted his private legal counsel and rewrote his entire will. He deliberately locked you out of the primary estate. He intentionally left absolute control of the trusts to the only person in this family who actually knows how to read a balance sheet. He gave me the keys to the empire because he knew I would use them to hunt you down and deliver the exact justice he was too sick to execute himself." I paused, letting my words sink deeply into their terrified minds. I looked at Courtney, who was now openly weeping against the side of her white Porsche. I looked at William, who was silently submitting as Agent Reynolds violently clamped the cold steel handcuffs around his wrists. I looked at the corrupt local officer who was kneeling in the dirt, surrounded by federal agents, his career permanently destroyed. "You called me a failure." I continued, staring directly into my mother's panic-stricken eyes. "You called me a disappointment because I refused to participate in your toxic, entitled delusions. But while you were busy spending stolen money on designer clothes and luxury cars, I was quietly mastering the exact forensic accounting skills required to completely dismantle your entire life. I tracked every single stolen dollar. I mapped every single offshore transaction. I built the perfect, flawless federal case against you, and I handed it directly to the authorities. I am not the family failure, Catherine. I am the architect of your absolute ruin." Two federal agents moved swiftly past me, grabbing Catherine by the arms and spinning her around. She shrieked again, kicking and thrashing wildly as the heavy steel cuffs clicked sharply around her wrists. They dragged her roughly toward the back of the waiting armored SUV, her expensive cashmere coat dragging through the dirty gravel. The reality of the situation finally shattered the last remaining fragments of loyalty among the conspirators. The heavy, oppressive threat of serving decades in a federal penitentiary instantly dissolved their arrogant alliance. Jason, who had been cowering silently against the side of the Porsche, suddenly snapped. The arrogant, entitled smirk he had worn since the roadside motel completely vanished, replaced by the desperate, pathetic cowardice of a man willing to sacrifice anyone to save his own skin. Jason saw the federal agents pulling out another set of handcuffs and stepping aggressively toward his position. He instantly threw his hands high into the air, his face pale and sweating profusely. He frantically pointed his trembling fingers directly at his weeping wife, Courtney, and his handcuffed father-in-law, William. "Wait, wait! Do not arrest me!" Jason screamed, his voice reaching a pathetic, high-pitched register of pure panic. I had absolutely nothing to do with the $15 million embezzlement scheme. I swear to God I knew nothing about the offshore shell companies or the stolen capital. It was all them. William orchestrated the entire banking fraud. Courtney forged the signature on the Vanguard property documents. She bragged to me about tracing the signature from an old family letter. I am completely innocent. I will cooperate fully with the federal investigation. I will formally testify to everything they did if you just grant me total legal immunity. Courtney's head snapped up, her tear-streaked face twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated shock and violent betrayal. She stared at her husband, unable to comprehend the sheer speed of his treacherous cowardice. "Jason! You pathetic, spineless coward!" Courtney screamed, lunging toward him with her hands curled into desperate, violent claws. "You spent the stolen money just as fast as I did. You bought that expensive watch on your wrist with my grandfather's cash. You drove that Porsche here today to help evict my sister." Jason practically climbed over the hood of the luxury vehicle to desperately escape his enraged wife scrambling frantically toward the protective line of federal agents. "I was manipulated," Jason shrieked, cowering behind a tall tactical officer. "She forced me to come here today. I want to speak to the federal prosecutor right now. I will give you the passwords to Courtney's private email accounts. I have the text messages proving they actively planned to physically destroy Julia's evidence." Courtney let out a primal, agonizing scream of total betrayal as the federal agents finally moved in, grabbing her arms and forcing her down against the hood of the white Porsche. She thrashed, violently screaming obscenities at the man who had just sold her out to the federal government to save himself. I stood on the porch, flanked by Alexander Pierce and Agent Reynolds, watching the beautiful, perfect Wilson family tear each other apart in the dirt. The eviction was officially over. My grandfather's legacy was finally safe. The heavy reinforced doors of the black armored SUVs flew open with perfect military synchronization. A dozen heavily armed federal agents poured out onto the sharp gravel, moving with terrifying and absolute tactical efficiency. They wore dark tactical gear with heavy Kevlar vests, emblazoned with the bright yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. They moved instantly to secure the perimeter, forming an impenetrable wall of federal authority around my terrified family. Two tall tactical officers immediately flanked my father violently, securing his arms behind his back. The sharp, metallic, ratcheting sound of the heavy steel handcuffs closing tightly around William Wilson's wrists echoed loudly in the crisp morning air. It was the definitive sound of his corporate empire permanently collapsing. William did not resist the physical restraint. He simply stood there, his shoulders slumped and his head bowed in utter defeat, as the officers conducted a rapid professional pat-down, searching his expensive tailored suit for concealed weapons or secondary devices. He was entirely broken. While William surrendered to the crushing reality of his situation, my mother chose to fight a completely unwinnable battle. Catherine's initial shock had rapidly mutated into a wild, hysterical panic. Two female federal agents had moved in to secure her, but Catherine thrashed violently against their firm grip. Her pristine white cashmere coat, previously a symbol of her unearned luxury, was now smeared with damp gray dirt and sharp gravel from her earlier stumble against the side of the Mercedes. "You cannot do this to me!" Catherine shrieked, her voice tearing through the serene mountain silence like a jagged, rusty blade. "Do you have any idea who I am? I am Catherine Wilson. I am a highly respected socialite. I sit on the board of 3 different major philanthropic charities. Women like me do not go to federal prison. You are making a catastrophic mistake. Let go of me right now." She kicked wildly, her expensive designer heels slipping and twisting on the loose stones, but the agents remained completely unfazed by her pathetic displays of entitlement. They forcefully pinned her arms behind her back and secured the steel handcuffs. Catherine let out a long, agonizing wail. Thick black streaks of expensive designer mascara and heavy eyeliner ran in dark, messy streams down her flushed cheeks, completely destroying her meticulously crafted mask of superiority. She looked ragged, wild, and entirely pathetic. The sheer volume of her hysterical screaming had effectively shattered the quiet morning tranquility of the exclusive Lake George community. The sprawling historic estates surrounding my grandfather's property were owned by some of the most wealthy and influential families on the entire eastern seaboard. These were people who valued discretion, privacy, and absolute quiet above all else. I looked past the chaotic scene playing out in my driveway and noticed the immediate fallout of my mother's screaming. Across the manicured property lines and over the low stone walls, the wealthy neighbors were emerging from their massive homes. Elderly men in expensive silk morning robes stepped out onto their elevated mahogany decks, holding steaming ceramic coffee cups. Wealthy women wrapped in thick cashmere shawls walked down to the edge of their manicured lawns, peering through the morning mist to witness the unprecedented spectacle. They were watching the mighty Wilson family being violently dismantled by the federal government. Catherine suddenly realized she was operating before an audience. She stopped thrashing and looked around, her eyes wide with a new, much deeper kind of terror. She saw the judgmental, whispering faces of the very same high society elites she had spent decades desperately trying to impress. She saw them pointing toward the flashing red and blue lights of the federal vehicles. She saw them watching her being dragged through the dirt in handcuffs with ruined makeup and torn clothing. The realization of her absolute, irreversible social death hit her far harder than the criminal charges. She had spent her entire adult life carefully curating an image of flawless, untouchable wealth. Now she was nothing but a public cautionary tale, a disgraced criminal being paraded before her peers. Catherine let out a single broken sob of pure humiliation, tucking her chin to her chest and desperately trying to hide her ruined face as the agents forcefully guided her toward the reinforced back doors of a waiting black SUV. They pushed her inside and slammed the heavy door shut, completely silencing her hysterics. With William and Catherine secured in the federal transport vehicles, the tactical teams began securing the perimeter and processing the physical evidence left in the driveway. Amidst the highly organized chaos, I noticed a subtle, desperate movement near the heavy stone pillars of the front gate. Officer Miller, the corrupt local municipal policeman who had arrogantly threatened to arrest me just 15 minutes ago, was quietly trying to disappear. He had slowly, silently backed away from the center of the driveway, keeping to the deep shadows cast by the towering pine trees. He was inching his way toward his marked police cruiser, desperately hoping the federal agents were too distracted by the high-profile arrests to notice a single dirty cop making a tactical retreat. He reached the door handle of his vehicle, his hands shaking violently as he tried to open it. He did not make it. Special Agent Reynolds had not missed a single detail. Reynolds turned sharply, his dark trench coat flaring, as he marched aggressively across the gravel toward the retreating officer. "Going somewhere," Officer Miller Reynolds demanded, his voice ringing with sharp, lethal authority. Miller froze instantly, his hand still clutching the door handle of his cruiser. He turned around, his face pale and slick with nervous sweat. "I was just returning to my normal patrol duties, sir," Miller stammered, his voice cracking pathetically. "I was just responding to a standard trespassing call. I had absolutely no idea these people were under federal investigation. I was just doing my job." Reynolds stepped directly into Miller's personal space, towering over the corrupt officer. "You were actively attempting to execute a forged legal document outside your established municipal jurisdiction to facilitate the theft of a $60 million estate," Reynolds stated, listing the facts with cold, mechanical precision. "You were acting as a private enforcer for a man currently under federal indictment for massive wire fraud. You are a disgrace to the badge you wear." Reynolds snapped his fingers, pointing to two approaching tactical agents. "Relieve him of his service weapon and his duty belt," Reynolds commanded. "Officer Miller, you are not returning to your patrol route. Internal Affairs is already waiting for you down at your precinct headquarters. They have full access to the bank records detailing the generous cash deposits William Wilson has been making into your private accounts for the past 3 years. You are completely finished." The agents moved in swiftly, stripping the terrified, corrupt officer of his weapon, his badge, and his radio, before placing him in the back of a separate transport vehicle. The driveway was slowly clearing. Jason had already been secured in a separate federal vehicle, eagerly cooperating with the authorities and spilling every single secret he possessed to save himself from a lengthy prison sentence. The moving truck that had been hired to plunder my grandfather's antique furniture had rapidly backed out of the estate the moment the federal agents had breached the gates, wanting absolutely no part of the unfolding disaster. William and Catherine were locked away, their fate entirely sealed by the crushing weight of undeniable forensic evidence. That left only one person remaining on the torn and ruined gravel: Courtney. My younger sister stood completely alone in the center of the massive circular driveway. The cold morning breeze whipped her perfectly styled blonde hair across her pale, shocked face. She looked at the heavy black federal SUV containing her parents. She looked at the separate vehicle containing the husband who had just viciously betrayed her without a single second of hesitation. She looked at her pristine white Porsche Macan, suddenly realizing that the expensive luxury vehicle was purchased with stolen, embezzled federal funds and would be immediately seized by the Government Asset Forfeiture Division. She was completely isolated. She had spent her entire life hiding securely behind the aggressive protection of our toxic parents and the stolen wealth they provided. Now that protective shield had been violently ripped away, leaving her entirely exposed to the harsh, unforgiving reality of her own actions. Courtney slowly turned to face the wooden porch. She looked up at me, standing flanked by Alexander Pierce and Agent Reynolds. The arrogant, entitled sneer that had permanently lived on her face for decades was entirely gone. Her knees suddenly gave out. She collapsed heavily onto the sharp gravel, tearing the fabric of her expensive designer trousers and scraping her bare skin. She did not care. She fell to her knees, her hands pressed against the dirt, looking up at me with wide, terrified eyes. Thick tears began streaming rapidly down her face, ruining her flawless makeup. "Julia, please!" Courtney begged, her voice a pathetic, high-pitched whine that echoed across the empty driveway. "They are taking absolutely everything. They are seizing the corporate accounts. They are seizing the primary residential home. They are going to take my car. I have absolutely no money in my personal accounts. I have nowhere else to go. Jason took everything and abandoned me. Please, you have to help me. You have this massive, beautiful villa. You have absolute control of the $60 million trust fund. You have all the power now. Just let me stay here with you. Let me live in one of the guest rooms. I will do whatever you want. I will follow your rules. We are family, Julia. We are sisters. Please do not throw me out onto the street like a common beggar." The silence that followed her desperate, pathetic plea was absolutely deafening. The only sound in the entire estate was the gentle lapping of the lake water against the wooden docks and the low, humming engines of the federal transport vehicles waiting to depart. Agent Reynolds crossed his arms over his chest, watching the interaction with stoic professional detachment. Alexander Pierce stood perfectly still, his hands resting casually in his tailored pockets, observing the final pathetic collapse of the Wilson family dynamic. I stood at the top of the wooden stairs, looking down at the weeping, broken woman kneeling in the dirt. I looked at the sister who had maliciously mocked my career choices. I looked at the sister who had gleefully participated in the systematic theft of my grandfather's legacy. I looked at the sister who had actively conspired to forge legal documents and physically throw me out of my own home just moments ago. She was begging for mercy from the very person she had spent her entire life trying to destroy. I remained perfectly composed, my face a mask of cold, unyielding granite as I prepared my final, absolute response. I raised the ceramic mug to my lips and took a slow, deliberate sip of my black coffee. The dark, bitter liquid matched the absolute coldness radiating through my veins. The morning sun illuminated the tear streaks cutting through Courtney's heavy designer foundation. She was shivering on the sharp gravel, her perfectly manicured hands coated in gray dust, reaching out toward the bottom step of the porch. Her desperate, pathetic sobs echoed across the sprawling estate, mingling with the harsh mechanical sounds of the federal transport vehicles shifting into gear. She truly believed that our shared blood would somehow magically erase decades of her malicious cruelty. She genuinely expected me to act like the weak, compliant sister they had all systematically abused for 34 years. I lowered my coffee mug and met her terrified, pleading eyes with an expression of absolute, profound indifference. I let the crushing silence stretch for another long, agonizing moment, ensuring she felt the full suffocating weight of her new reality. "Call an Uber, Courtney," I said, my voice dropping to a smooth, lethal whisper that cut directly through her hysterical sobbing. "There is not enough space for you here." Courtney gasped violently, as if I had physically struck her across the face. Her mouth opened and closed in silent, suffocating shock. She looked wildly around the empty driveway, realizing with sudden, terrifying clarity that her personal nightmare was absolute and permanent. Alexander Pierce let out a low, sharp breath of dark amusement, stepping back to allow me passage. Agent Reynolds offered a firm, respectful nod of pure professional validation. I did not waste another single second looking at the wreckage of the Wilson family. I turned my back on the pathetic kneeling woman on the gravel. I walked steadily across the wide wooden porch, my footsteps echoing with absolute final authority. I reached the massive antique oak front doors of my grandfather's historic villa. I grasped the heavy brass handle, stepped over the threshold, and pulled the massive door firmly shut behind me. The heavy metallic click of the deadbolt sliding into place was the most beautiful, liberating sound I had ever heard in my entire life. The legal and financial destruction of William and Catherine Wilson was absolute terrifying and incredibly swift. Special Agent Reynolds and his elite financial crimes unit spent the next 3 months meticulously dissecting the massive mountain of forensic evidence I had handed them in that roadside diner. The trial was a highly public, spectacular humiliation for my parents. They had spent decades aggressively curating a flawless image of impenetrable wealth and high society grace. The federal prosecutors completely shattered that illusion in open court, displaying their immense greed, their pathetic incompetence, and their brazen criminality for the entire world to witness. William attempted to blame his corrupt accountants. Catherine attempted to blame her husband. Their expensive corporate defense attorneys were completely paralyzed by the sheer volume of undeniable, unencrypted metadata proving their direct involvement in the $15 million embezzlement scheme. The federal judge showed them absolutely zero mercy during the final sentencing hearing. He looked down from the bench with total disgust as he handed both William and Catherine consecutive 10-year sentences in a maximum security federal penitentiary. They were immediately stripped of every single fraudulent asset they had acquired. Vanguard Holdings, acting with the ruthless surgical precision, Alexander Pierce was famous for executed an aggressive series of corporate liens that completely liquidated Wilson Enterprises. The sprawling suburban mansions were seized and auctioned. The offshore Cayman Island accounts were instantly frozen and repatriated back into my grandfather's legitimate trusts. My parents went from ruling high society boardrooms to sitting in sterile concrete cells wearing standard-issue orange jumpsuits, completely stripped of their wealth, their status, and their toxic pride. Jason secured his desperate, pathetic immunity deal by aggressively testifying against his own wife and her parents, but his cowardice bought him a miserable existence. He was permanently blacklisted from the entire financial sector, wandering between cheap rental apartments and struggling to survive. Courtney legally filed for total crushing bankruptcy. The high society elite she worshipped completely abandoned her overnight, treating her like a highly contagious disease. With zero actual skills and zero work ethic, Courtney was violently thrown into the harsh, unforgiving reality of the working class. She currently works a minimum wage job as a waitress at a greasy diner in New Jersey. Her designer clothes permanently replaced by a stained polyester uniform, and her unearned arrogance entirely replaced by chronic bone-deep exhaustion. 14 months after that chaotic, beautiful morning on the gravel driveway, I stood on the newly restored upper balcony of the Lake George villa. The crisp mountain air carried the fresh, clean scent of pine and deep water. The historic stone estate had been meticulously, completely restored to its original magnificent glory. I was no longer just an elite corporate forensic auditor. I officially launched my own highly specialized independent firm, focusing exclusively on uncovering massive corporate fraud and executing aggressive, hostile financial takeovers. My primary and most lucrative corporate client was Vanguard Holdings. Alexander Pierce and I had formed an incredibly aggressive, highly profitable partnership. I provided the flawless forensic targeting, and he provided the ruthless financial leverage. Together, we were systematically dismantling corrupt corporate empires across the eastern seaboard and generating staggering, legitimate wealth in the process. I rested my hands on the smooth, polished wood of the balcony railing, looking out over the peaceful, glittering expanse of Lake George. I had actively, fiercely protected the honorable legacy of the only man in my family who had ever truly valued my mind. I built a terrifyingly successful corporate empire entirely on my own uncompromising terms. I stood alone on the balcony of my grandfather's estate, a woman of immense independent wealth and undeniable terrifying power, finally completely free. My future was brilliant, and my past was permanently dead. I smiled quietly, knowing I had finally won this absolute war. The cost of toxic loyalty and the power of independence. Society frequently insists that blood is thicker than water, pressuring us to forgive the unforgivable simply because the harm comes from family. However, as this story brutally illustrates, shared DNA is never a free pass for systemic abuse, manipulation, or exploitation. When the people who are supposed to nurture and protect you become your most ruthless predators, blind loyalty transforms into a dangerous trap. Recognizing toxic family dynamics, whether it is the constant emotional belittling, blatant financial theft, or the toxic hierarchy of a golden child, is the first and most critical step toward reclaiming your life. True empowerment does not come from waiting for your abusers to magically recognize your value. It comes from building your own impenetrable foundation. Julia did not beg for her family's respect. She quietly weaponized their gross underestimation of her. By securing her own specialized knowledge, forging powerful independent alliances, and silently building undeniable leverage, she created a fortress they could not breach. Financial independence and emotional detachment are the ultimate shields against narcissistic manipulation. You do not owe your success, your resources, or your inner peace to individuals who only value you for what they can aggressively extract. Ultimately, the sweetest and most profound revenge is not merely watching corrupt people face the devastating legal and social consequences of their own actions. It is the absolute unshakable peace that washes over you when you finally lock the door on their chaos. You have the absolute right to define your own worth, enforce ironclad boundaries, and protect your own legacy. Have you ever had to draw a hard line to protect yourself from toxic family members, or rebuild your life entirely on your own terms? Share your experiences in the comments below. If this story of unapologetic resilience and justice resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe for more empowering narratives. Remember, your peace is always worth protecting.